Welcome to the Moonflower Path podcast. This space is for the highly sensitive, the creatives, the earth-loving, the caregivers, the weirdos, the feelers, the change makers, and dreamers of the world. Here, we are all about guiding you to trust your body intuition so you can find home and shift culture. Through the exploration of somatic practice, self-care, and seasonal ritual, my hope is that you will be inspired to be in harmony with yourself and in a dance with the earth. I'm your host, Carolyn, and I'm so honored and grateful to be here with you today. Hello, Moonflower, and welcome to our first guest conversation of season 2. If it's your first time here, welcome. Really lovely to have you here. And please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and download our cozy free resource called In Tune with the Moon, helping you to listen to, trust in, and honor your body intuition so that you can feel empowered to take up space in your life with the moon by your side every step of the way. You can get access to this free resource by clicking the link in the show notes or visiting our website, themoonflowerpath.com. Today's guest is not only an amazing person, a wise soul, and a dear friend. She actually happens to be my kind of like biz bestie or accountability buddy when it comes to running this business, because she also runs her own private practice as a counselor, and we meet up every 2 weeks on Zoom and talk all things business, because it is a lonely and a challenging path at times, as well as a beautiful path. So just kind of side note for folks who are listening, who are creative or tender-hearted business owners, I would strongly encourage you to get yourself a accountability buddy when it comes to running your business, because it's been really, really helpful for me. But she's also a counselor. She's also somebody who works professionally in the field of mental health, which feels really apt because we do talk a lot about things in this podcast that kind of walk the line of supporting folks when it comes to their mental health. And I'm not a counselor, I'm not a therapist, and so it feels really right to be able to bring this conversation to you to just accompany all the other conversations that we have. But very specifically, this conversation, we talk about grief, because Mady is going to be guiding the Moonflower members through a workshop later on in October. And to learn a little bit more about that workshop, you can visit our website, and I'll tell you a little bit about it more here. So Mady will explore what gently grieving can look like for us in a community that doesn't often shine light on how important the process of grieving is to wholehearted, authentic living. This workshop will give folks an opportunity to engage in grief in a curious, compassionate, and gentle way to help us understand what integrating grief into our individual space can look like. Following the open dialogue, Mady will lead the Moonflower Path members through the ritual practice of building a grief altar. The workshop will offer a somatic element to ground into the workshop and release out of it. This workshop takes place on October 27th at 7 p.m. EST, so that's a Friday. It's the last Friday of the month in the evening for folks who are in EST timing. And like I said, you can join this gathering by becoming a Moonflower member at the Fireside tier, which gives you access to this workshop as well as everything else in the membership by visiting our website, themoonflowerpath.com/community space, or clicking the link in the show notes. However, you can also just listen to this conversation, and I know that you will find a lot of support out of it. So a little bit more about our guest. Mady, she, her, is a registered social worker, counselor, and the clinical director of Burn Bright Counseling. Burn Bright Counseling is a queer affirming counseling practice specializing in supporting the LGBTQ2S+ community. She has lived on unceded Lekwungen and Wasanic territories, otherwise known as Victoria, BC in Canada, for the past 10 years. Mady is also a daily griever. It is through her intimate relationship with grief that she has been able to understand what an important part of healing, growing, and living that grief plays. Mady seeks grounding and stability in time by the ocean, in the forest, and on her skates playing roller derby. In this conversation, we talk about Mady's personal story with grief and how it's shaped how she shows up as a human and a counselor, the somatic side of grieving, how we all experience grief in different forms and different ways, and how to support yourself through its ups and downs, how to gently support a friend in their grieving process, and what to expect in the very special Gently Grieving workshop happening in the Moonflower Path Community Space later this month, which you can register for today. This is a very tender and vulnerable conversation. And I just want to mention a trigger warning around subjects of grief, loss, and death. So if you know that listening to those subjects be talked about in very tender and vulnerable ways will bring you distress, please avoid listening to this episode. However, if you are moving through a period of grief, or you know somebody who is, or you have an intimate relationship in the past with it, or you're just curious to learn more, then I would really encourage you continue to listen to this conversation. I feel really honored that Mady felt so comfortable to share as vulnerably and as tender as she did, because I know you'll get a lot out of it no matter what your relationship with grief is. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hello, Mady. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Carolyn. It's so nice to be here with you.
Please share with the listeners a bit about what parts of your journey have led you to the work you're now doing and are so passionate about.
Such a good question. And I'm sure that I could do a whole podcast on that. So I will summarize to the best of my abilities. Because I think that it's probably all the moments in my life and many parts that make up the fabric of my being to lead me to where I am. But so that people can understand who I am, maybe I'll start with where I am now and carry us backwards. But as people heard, I'm a counselor, and I specialize in supporting like queer folks with like a varying subjects. And the thing that I'm here to talk about today is grief, because I also support a lot of people around grief and have my own experiences with grief. In terms of becoming a counselor, I think that from a very young age, I always was someone in a supporting role to like friends and family, things that went on in my family unit that I ended up being like supportive role for, kind of like helping. I was that friend that a lot of people wanted to talk to. I think I gave a lot of advice when I was younger. Once you train to be a counselor, you learn that's not really what you're supposed to do. But as a teenager, you don't know that. So you just give the advice. It felt really natural. I think my transition into counseling, it didn't happen really. I didn't have my like sight set on being a counselor necessarily. I just knew I wanted to help people. And through every job that I've had and the supervisors that I've had and the people that I've worked with, very smoothly did I end up, I feel like, where I am, which I feel very grateful for. And in terms of supporting queer people, quickly, I found like I am a queer person, and I found that a lot of the young people that I was working with really appreciated like the fact that I could understand lots of the nuances of like walking around in this world as a queer person, and how queerness intersects with a lot of other challenges that they might have been having, like mental health, like family relationships, like romantic relationships. And so I felt like what a lot of youth were telling me was that they didn't have other counselors like that, and that it was hard to talk to other counselors about those things. And so I started my practice 2 years ago with the intention of having a place where people don't have to come and only talk about, things related to queerness, but what they can know walking into Burn Bright Counseling is that we understand and we have context for like who they are and how they're living their life, and the intersections of queerness in the other spaces of their life. And that feels really good to be able to do that. And it's obviously come from a place of like my own experiences and wanting to also be understood as a queer person, like in my healthcare. And all my other clinicians are queer as well. And so that's in a nutshell what led me there. Again, it's a little bit more complex, but we don't have time for all. And in terms of grief, do you want me to share what has led me to grief work?
Yeah.
I think that I have been acquainted with grief since I was quite young. I've been going to funerals of people in my family since I was probably 3, 4, I think, that I can remember, that I actually have a memory of. And so I think grief has actually always been very present in my life in a death formation too. So, and we'll go into it, but grief is not just death, but specifically, I think my earliest formations, of like grief memories are death. And it's always been there, but 7 years ago, my mom and my aunt passed away about 2 months away from each other. And my relationship with grief changed dramatically in that year. Became very well acquainted with a kind of loss that is really inexplainable. It's much bigger and deeper and harder than any other kind of loss or grief experience that I've had. And I would say that kind of catapulted me into my own grief healing, but then also working to help others kind of understand and walk with their grief. So that is kind of the moment, I would say, that deepened my understanding of grief. And maybe even gave me that kind of desire to want to help other people understand theirs too.
Did you find that so how long had you been a counselor? I'm like going off script here. So how long were you a counselor professionally, before you lost your aunt and your mom?
I mean, I've been in the field, I've been post undergraduate degree in the field for 10 years now. So if my mom died, so 3-ish, maybe 3.5, 4, maybe that does. Yeah. 3.5, 4.
Okay. The reason I ask that is because you must have had some sort of like foundational and like cognitive and like educational knowledge of folks' experience with grief. And you do say that you did have a personal experience with it, but it must have been, I can imagine, and I'm curious to hear more about your experience with shifting from knowing it like up in your head and then experiencing it on like a real visceral body level. And I'd be curious to hear about if there was anything that you were, it's probably hard to put this into words, but like almost surprised by, of like, you're like, oh, like I know this, but then when it happens, you're like, whoa, did I even know this? Like, I'd be curious to hear about that.
Oh yeah. I feel like it's so funny because I knew grief, but I don't feel like I knew grief until my mom and my aunt. Yeah. Like, and I feel like I wasn't able to like make sense of it or like understand it. I wasn't able to bring the like personal experience and the like knowledge as a counselor, right? And kind of like the understanding of grief and loss. I mean, I took a course in my undergrad on grief and loss, but as I have said to many people, many of my students and things before too, is like, reading is great. Understanding things is great, but it cannot beat the like personal experience. I mean, you learn far more. Like I can learn all about how to counsel someone in school and do, pretend like do things. And it's not that that doesn't help, because it does, but until I'm actually in it and doing it and having like real life, real time supervision, that's when you like build the kind of like holistic competency of being able to like put your like knowledge and like what you learned in school and then your like intuitive and personal understandings into it. And so that didn't really happen until after my mom and my aunt passed away and I was able to like work through some of my healing journey. The things that I was surprised about, so many things. So many things. At that whole, I think it feels cliche to say it, but that whole like there's not like one way to like grieve. There's not like a right way to grieve or one way. But I think what was surprising was watching how myself, my mom, my family members, right, like how all of us coped really differently, right, and what that looked like for each of us and how that interacted with each other. And some people surprised me and some people didn't, and in moments I surprised myself as well, and in moments I didn't. I think the other thing that surprised me that you don't really find out until you go through something like this, and I think there's a part of me that might have known it, but is that grief like that never goes away. So it isn't actually a matter of like healing past the grief. It's a matter of like figuring out how I live with it now and how I walk with it, like how to make it, a part of me and a part of my everyday, really. How to leave space for it. I think that I might have known that, but now I really know that in a different way.
Mm. I think that's really beautifully put. I think it ties in really nicely to kind of what we're here talking about and also what the themes and the lessons are around this season, like a fall, where like I find fall definitely is a celebration of those parts of ourselves that are whatever, that are dark or heavy or whatever we want to call them, and that it's not about getting rid of them or moving past them or being cured by them or whatever, and that it's having the skills and the experience and the ability and the support system to be able to have it be there and be a part of you, not overwhelm you, not take over your life, but that it's still there and that that's okay.
Mm-hmm. And important, in fact.
Yeah, it's
Like
because it's a part of you.
cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's really nicely put. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Also, I realized I'm like terrible with math and counting because I'm a counselor, not a mathematician, but it's been 6 years, not 7. So it's been 6 years. Yeah. So that makes sense. I was counseling for about 4 before.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think the other thing that I think is really fun about what you said, whatever, fun's not the right word, but is it just drives home again the intuitive knowledge that we have that lived experience has just as much weight, if not more. I don't know, we could have a whole conversation about that, to like having the piece of paper that says that you're trained in the thing, right? Because that's a huge thing that I think is creative experience is like, oh, am I able to talk about this thing if I haven't officially learned it? Like, well, I don't know. I would argue that having the lived experience speaks volumes, volumes. Because again, it plays around with that difference between learning something and feeling something. And your body is so much of who you are.
Yeah. I mean, I think knowing comes in many different ways. We know things in all different kinds of avenues, right? Like you said, we can know something in our body, and that doesn't make it any less real or true than someone who knows it from a book, or like, but it does make it different, right? And in fact, I think knowing something in our bodies, knowing something in our, like, in our soul, in our hearts, I mean, that is far more of a powerful understanding than reading it or learning it from a teacher. And I think, in my opinion, the best, like, in terms of my particular field, I think that me being the best counselor that I can be means like integrating knowledge, that helps me with like very specific skills, but like integrating that into what I know in my heart and my body, like in my intuition. It's both. I can't do what I do personally without the somatic understanding of what's going on in the room or what's going on with the other person or with me. So I think it's an integration in my mind for what I do anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so on that note, I did want to talk about, so but I'm going to say it anyways. So this podcast is about somatic self-care. The Moonflower Path in its entirety is about somatic self-care. But I'd really love to hear your thoughts on the self-care industry as a whole. That's something that I'm like finding myself being really passionate about and like wanting to talk about, is like self-care is a buzzword, but here in this space we're trying to like make it be richer but also create space for all types of self-care. So I'd be really curious, because you are somebody who does support folks in their self-care in a different way, but definitely are a support system in their ecosystem of self-care. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on self-care, the industry, what's working for folks, what isn't.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is definitely your expertise, but I will share with you my thoughts for sure, because I do think that it is a buzzword, and I think, in therapeutic spaces it has also become, right, like a buzzword, in the sense of like, I do talk to my clients about self-care a lot, but I think I at this point move away from like blanket self-care, like, what self-care, right? Like, I think sometimes I move just a little bit more towards like, how are you going to care for you? What would care look like for you today? And I think that as a whole, as many things, it became commercialized, right? So the idea of self-care became very commercialized, right? And moved into like, self-care looks like spending money on these particular things that are going to help you with your self-care, right? And moved a little bit into also like luxury and into those kind of avenues, I think. And then I think that folks, what I really love about like what the Moonflower Path does, what you do, is that I think that you bring it into a far more like it can be indulgent, but also that indulgent doesn't necessarily mean like consuming, and like it can mean creating, it can mean like resting, it can mean moving your body, it can mean being in community, and that care and self-care for us like has far more many facets than, I think what the commercialized version of that looks like, right? And I think you really do a good job at making it something that feels sustainable. I think that is what I feel like self-care, when it can work, is when it's like sustainable for people, right? When it's something that's like, I can actually integrate this into my life, into my like day to day, right? And I think that with that understanding, I think we were talking the other day and you were talking about like painting your nails, right? And I have another friend that's like her self-care thing, right? And what a sustainable thing, because, like watching TV or being with friends or, being in the craft circle and painting your nails. For me, like reading in the morning after I wake up and I read for a little bit, like that is a sustainable thing that I can do. And I get my books from the library and, right, like making it something that is actually a little bit more like ritualistic versus like something I do when I get really stressed. I think that's kind of like how I try and treat care when I'm talking with people, is like, this isn't just something you do once you're stressed or like once you already had it up to here. Like it has to be preventative as well. And if you can like add it into your routine, that is going to be, I think, the most sustainable way to like care for yourself, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does make sense. Yeah, yeah. I do you find that in conversations that you have that that is the biggest thing that comes up, like when and if you are supporting folks around their self-care, that the biggest thing that you notice, like when something does click with caring for themselves, that it's the things, like it's finally when they get to that point where they're like, oh, I'm just choosing this thing as my self-care. It's because it's something that I already do, that it already brings me joy. Like, do you find that that's what you see folks typically making it accessible, sustainable?
I think, okay, so this is the other thing about self-care, I guess.
Mm.
What I actually find that I work on most, I'll tell you, is it's a little bit less like it's already something that I do, but more like something that I wanted to do or something that I like don't do enough of, right? Like for example, like writing in a journal, right? And people are like, yeah, I like haven't been doing that regularly, but I want to. And like that's the thing that I'm going to do for myself, right? Or people who are like creatives, right? Being like, oh, I'm going to like actually set aside time for art instead of just being like, if I have extra time, I'll do it. They're like, okay, I'm going to actually set it aside, like, once every couple days or right. Because I would say a lot of folks that I work with, like, especially in the beginning, like there isn't a lot of care happening for self, right? And the other side, the other like really strong feeling I have about self-care in the industry is that self-care, real honest care for yourself, it's not all lovely and it's not all nice and sweet and fun and relaxing. That's not what it looks like. And I think that's the biggest thing that I talk to with clients that I work with is more about the hard shit. That's like the hard stuff that is so important and is care, like making yourself food, like, we're really depressed and we don't want to eat. Self-care is eating. Self-care is not having a bubble bath and it might be, but that's not the self-care that's actually going to like help you, it's like after being in a depression spiral, like cleaning your house and doing all your dishes, that is care for yourself. Right. And in fact, in terms of like integrating care on a regular basis, I'm like, doing your dishes every day is actually care for yourself. Right. Like I know that self-care in the industry has made it very like pretty and very nice and very like, again, luxury. And I'm a little bit more, I think, honestly focused on the practical pieces of like, when I say care, like if you think about caring for like an animal or like a small human, how do you care for them? Sure, you give them baths and you pet them and you relax with like animals, obviously. You play with them, like but what else do? You feed them, you clean up after them, you make sure that they like young folks, you make sure they have like clean clothes and like that their hair is brushed, right? That's also care for us. So I think I like often am working on those pieces with people too, is like that practical basic care of like, this is actually what I need to be able to kind of like function and stabilize and feel in my body and feel grounded.
Okay, so for people who are not watching, I'm like nodding enthusiastically because like, yes, oh my gosh, yes to all of this. I just recorded, and that by this time it will have already come out, but I just recorded an episode a few days ago where I talk about the difference between the things that we want to do
Mm,
compared to the things that we need to do. Where
yeah.
like, I don't often want, I mean, when I'm really feeling like crap, like, I don't often want to get out of bed. Um,
Yeah.
but is doing what we want to do really what we should always be doing? And it does get really nuanced. Like, we should
Yeah.
be able to have desires and longings and want to want, and that's allowed. But this journey is absolutely one where we have to practice discernment between like the wants and the needs. So I think that's really, really awesome that you've shared that. I'm really grateful that you've shared that. That like, yeah, self-care is like, it's like pretty shitty sometimes.
Yeah, it's hard.
And
It's
it's really hard.
not all the easy stuff, you know? And but it's important. Caring for ourselves is important, and it's not always easy, but um all of those pieces have to be there, you know? I mean, if we're in a depression spiral and we're having a bath with a bath bomb every day, that's super good, and it's nice to do that for you. But that's also likely not going to get us any closer to crawling out of that depression spiral, you know. It'll give us some relief temporarily, hopefully, maybe, but you know, it's some of the other self-care pieces that we don't really want to do, but are probably going to help us feel, if anything, this is what I always say, if anything, it's not going to make us feel worse to clean the apartment. It's not going to make us feel worse to eat food, to do our dishes. Maybe it won't make us feel better, but it sure as heck isn't making us feel worse.
Yeah, and I think one thing before we get to the next question that I feel like I do want to interject here is one of the things that I love about this podcast and about these conversations and about this conversation is that I do love that it's not like, we're not saying like, these are the things that you can do to make sure that you feel better, right? Like, we're not here for that because that's not how it works.
No.
And so if you're listening and you're feeling maybe a little discouraged by that, and like, we're hoping to like walk away with some very kind of easy tactics and tools, um, I just want to be like, the biggest thing I think of this journey is being really compassionately curious. I feel like if you're looking for some like blanket statement, is like, compassionate curiosity is going to be your one of your biggest companions. Um, because yeah, as you can hear, like, it's messy and it's all over the place, and self-care is like so many things, and it's a journey.
Yeah. And some days you're going to be better at it than others. Every day we're not going to be able to take care of ourselves
Yeah,
at like 100%. And that's okay too. That's part of it.
absolutely. Yeah. Hello, gentle listener. Carolyn here, interrupting today's episode to tell you about our new free resource called In Tune with the Moon. Learn to listen to, trust in, and honor your body intuition so you can feel empowered to take up space in your life with the moon by your side every step of the way. This free resource includes digital moon phase calendars. So that's pretty phone wallpapers and widgets that have a moon phase calendar on them from now until the end of the year, and they'll be updated in the new year. 4 lunar ritual videos that are about 30 minutes in length and always follow the same comforting ritual of some gentle yoga, some meditation, and some lunar inspired journal prompts. And yes, these are cozy and accessible. All bodies, all mobility levels are very much welcome. And a digital lunar journal to deepen your relationship with yourself and the moon. By downloading this resource, you'll also begin to receive our monthly Moonflower journal, filled with cozy and seasonal self-care resources. Had I mentioned that it's all for free? Get in tune with the moon as well as with yourself by clicking the link in the show notes or visiting our website, themoonflowerpath.com. Okay, I need to look back at my questions because I feel like we went off on a tangent. On a more personal level, what are ways that you practice self-care?
Great question. This probably won't come as a surprise to most people, but therapy. Another one of the hard ones. I've been in therapy on and off since I was 6 years old. So, for anyone who thinks you should be like finished your counseling journey, or you like, yeah, I'll be in therapy for my whole life. So I go to therapy regularly, and I have a wonderful counselor, and it's a really good fit. And I've been seeing this counselor since my mom like passed away. So we really started with lots of grief work and, continued out into the rest of my life. I also play roller derby, and I would classify that as a form of my self-care, specifically if we're going to talk about somatic, right? Because I would say that playing a sport for me is like, I didn't growing up, and for me playing roller derby is a way where I really get out of my head and into my body. But there's lots of emotions in roller derby. We always say like there's crying in roller derby, because there so is. Lots of us cry all the time. It's like very emotional, but it's allowed to be, and it's also this like physical representation of our emotions. So I would say that is a form of my self-care, like 100%. It's also my physical activity, like the majority of it, which is self-care for those who didn't connect that. I spend a lot of time at the ocean. I live on the Lekwungen and Wasanic territories, in like otherwise known as Victoria in British Columbia, on Vancouver Island. So I live right near the ocean, and I go there a lot. And I have always since I moved here, but especially now, like every weekend, pretty much walk there like every Saturday, every Sunday, and sit by the ocean, and luckily, we don't get really snow, so we do it all winter long as well. So I would say like, my connection to the ocean feels really like a really strong form of self-care. I am also learning to take days off, like extra days, like stat holidays and things, because as an entrepreneur, like, I get to decide my own schedule. And so I would also say that's becoming a form of my self-care as well. And as you probably noticed, most of these things are not like the like fancy things, right, that I was talking about. And I think that's how my self-care journey has also really shifted, is a lot of the ways that I feel like I actually care for myself has to do a little bit more with these like practical, like, and soul filling things that I do. And sometimes I don't want to go for a walk. I would be honest. I'm really tired sometimes, like play a big roller derby game on Saturday, and on Sunday I'm like, wow, my body hurts so much. I don't really want to go for a walk. But then I go for a walk by the ocean, and I'm like, oh wow, that was so great for my body and my soul, and to like be outside in nature. Wow. So yeah, those are a few ways. I mean, there's many ways. I think I try and integrate it into like most things that I do in my life, but those are the big ones.
Okay. I I haven't actually seen this reel, but Sarah has like mentioned this. Sarah, my wife, has mentioned this reel to me a couple times. That apparently like was really popular during COVID, but it's like people going on their like
Oh yeah.
pandemic walks, and it's like
Yeah.
going on my stupid walk for my stupid mental health. It's just like yes.
So good. Yeah, that's exactly it. I know you get that too. You walk too lots.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I do. And if I didn't have my dog Nala, I don't think I would walk nearly as much as I do. And I'm very grateful for that, having that excuse. I can't skip it. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay, we're gonna jump back into grief and talk, because you mentioned this a little bit briefly in your answer of the somatic experience of grief. So I'd love for you to expand more on that, on what grief is and how very specifically it is a somatic experience.
I mean, I don't know if I can define grief in a very nice wrapped up bow, but uh, grief is like an overwhelming experience of, I would say, like loss. And what that loss is, it really depends, right? I mean, it can be a loss of a physical person or a thing, you know, a material item, but it can also be like the loss of a future, an expected future. It can be the loss of like a sense of self or like a sense of somebody else. Like it's not always like a death that ends up leading us to grief. Like we can grieve when we lose our job, right? Like we can grieve when we grieve when we break up with people, when families separate, right? So grief is complex and complicated, but I think if I was to summarize, it would be, you know, the feelings, the experience that takes place due to some form of loss, which if we think about it that way, that happens all the time, right? In our lives. Many times will we lose something, right? Somatically, again, I think like some of my earliest like somatic memories maybe of grief are like, if I'll paint a picture, maybe one of the first funeral I remember is my uncle Sean, who died of AIDS when I was 4, I think. And my mother, who was stone cold. Not really, but she wasn't stone cold, but she definitely didn't cry a lot, is what I'll say. She was so like warm and open, but like she was stoic. That's what I'm looking for. She was like very stoic, I will say, not stone cold. The first, like one of the memories at that funeral is my mom like crying, like wailing, crying, and her body, like I can see her body like crumbling, and my father like, you know, holding her and kind of like comforting her. But you know, even that from a visceral or from a somatic sense, like it's just like this crumbling of her whole body. Fast forward, I'm 13 and my grandfather passed away, my dad's dad. And I remember lying in his house. So we had, you know, because we sold his house, and I'm lying in his bedroom where his bed used to be with like starfish on the floor, and talking to him like this, you know, in the ether, right? Like telling him how much I loved him. And I felt him and my other grandparents, because he was the last grandparent to die. So like all 4 of my grandparents, I could feel all of them with me, and my whole body, you know, I'm crying and my whole body is like tingling. Right. And it was like, you know, I felt like a lot of lightness, surprisingly enough, in that moment. Fast forward, you know, to my mom and my aunt, my mom's sister, you know, passing away. And so they had cancer. And so we knew, so we found out, and my mom, it was about 6 months when we found out, and my aunt, it was like 3-ish or so. And I think that somatic experience was really different and really complicated because it hurt a lot to be in my body, because it hurt a lot to know that I was like losing my mother and my aunt. And so I spent, I think, a lot of time in my brain and out of my body, which was a protection mechanism, which is okay. And, you know, like crying in Derby, you can't not be in your body in Derby, right? And I remember I was scrimmaging one time and I like burst into tears, you know, could not stop. And a fellow like skater of mine who lost her brother and knew grief very deeply came and like undid my skates for me, and we're like taking them off, and our safety officer was like, "Are you okay?" And my friend's like, "Oh, it is not it is not a physical injury, right?
Mm.
Because being in my body, there was like no way to stop that pain.
Mm-hmm.
So it took me some time, I think, to come back into my body, and I would go in waves of like being in and being very emotional and very upset, and then coming out of it, and then going in and coming out. And it was like a very weird roller coaster
Mm-hmm.
for me. And I mean, I'm in my body now, and I have been for a long time, which feels really nice, but it definitely took some time to want to be back in my body frequently. And then the lingering somatic effects are that, you know, you feel it, like even when I talk about it, right? I mean, I can feel it in my chest as I'm talking about it, right? And when it comes to that time of year, or like the time of year when we found out, or the time of year that she passed away, like things just don't feel right in my body, right? I'm tired, I'm like sore, I'm like pretty exhausted during those times. And sometimes I forget why. Like, I mean, well, I don't really forget why now, but not with my mom. Sometimes with like my aunt's timeline, you know, I like forget, and then I'll be like, oh, right. My mom's timeline is like very solidly locked away there. And but my aunt lost her mom when she was 27, and she's in her 60s now, and she said the same thing happens. She like will get really tired and emotional and like just like exhausted, and her body aches at the same time every year, and then she realizes, shit, this is when her mom died. Which just gives such evidence to like how connected our like emotional and physical bodies are. We do not give enough credit for that, I think.
Hello, Moonflower. Carolyn here. Just wanting to jump into this episode after some pretty raw subject matter to offer you just an invitation to take a deep breath, just to reset, reground, come back into your body if you're feeling some things. So let's do this together. Inhale. Out the mouth, let it go. Okay, let's jump back in. So thank you for sharing all of that. That's big, big stuff. And it sounds like acknowledging your body and being as gentle and caring and soft with your body as you can during the process is essential. And also being really kind with the periods of time when you don't actually really want to be in your body,
Mhm.
and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I let it happen, you know. And I I think I think I was in so much pain that I don't know if I could judge, but that's what I would say is that compassion that you're talking about is like really try and suspend judgment, because
Yeah.
like grief is hard and it's tough. And I think I trusted myself to come back in eventually, because I always have. And I knew that's what I wanted to do. But our bodies and our brains are really smart, and they protect us sometimes. And I think I kind of handed the reins over a little bit to my body
Mm-hmm.
and said, okay, like, okay, I'll like trust that, you know, when I'm out of my body, maybe that's like, I'll trust that my body's doing what it needs to do in this very moment, so that I don't know, I was also in school. So, you know, like maybe I needed to be out of my body so I could write a paper. I don't know. Right. And I just trusted it.
Okay, I feel like this is a really nice time in the episode, in the conversation, for us to come to this question. So, to the listeners who are navigating a period of grief right now, as you're listening, what would be one gentle thing that you'd like to say to them?
I think that what I want to say is that I know that it hurts and that it's hard.
Period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can't know that until you know that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This season is a time that those feelings might come up. And as, like, I'm speaking directly to the listeners here. So like, as you're listening, you might be noticing that, like, as you're listening, some stuff is coming up, like some emotions might be bubbling up or some physical sensations are bubbling up. And maybe Mady is putting some words to what you didn't even know that you were feeling, or an experience that you were feeling. So yeah, listen to those words of like, it's tough.
Mm-hmm.
Just recognizing that. Yeah, and there's no one straight way or one one straight line on how to do this.
Yeah. I mean, we are built for it. We're built for all the emotions that we have, even though some of us, myself included, I think you too, Carolyn, right? And when you're a sensitive person, we might feel like emotions are too big for our body, but they're not. They're big, but they're not too big for us. We can do it, and we don't have to do it alone. I think that's the other piece, is like, grief is individual, but coping doesn't have to be.
Yeah, so that's something else that I wanted to touch on before we get into the very last question of talking about the workshop that you'll be facilitating in the community spaces. What I don't know, advice, whatever. What would you say in terms of supporting folks that are grieving? Because maybe that's not an experience that listeners personally have an experience with, but like, it touches all folks. And so, yeah, talk about that a little bit more if you can, about being in community and grieving together and supporting each other.
Mm-hmm. This one's so hard. I think some of the things that I think about when I'm supporting, like when I think about people supporting each other or supporting a loved one or like grieving as a community, is first of all, like, let people grieve, right? Like, let's not try and turn away from it, or like do the, like, it's fine, it's okay, it's okay. It's like, not okay. It's not. Like, it's shitty and it's hard and it hurts, and like, just like letting it be really hard. And it can be challenging to hold other people's grief. And listen, not everyone has to, and not everyone does feel comfortable with that, and that's okay too. But if you can, just let them, right? That's part of the process. So, listen to them. That's another thing, because people will often tell you, they can sometimes tell you what they need or what they want. And it might not be in the terms of like, I'm going to feel better if you do this, but it might be like, do you want to like come and watch a movie with me? Listen to them. That's probably what they actually want to do, is, even if they're not watching the movie, even if you are actually talking instead of watching, like, just listen to what they say that they want, right? I think grief as an individual thing is really complicated when we're grieving in community. Like, if there's like for example, right now on the mainland in BC, there are like really devastating fires, like, raging and destroying communities. My aunt lives really close, and like part of her community is on fire. And it's interesting to listen and watch about their community kind of like grieving and what's happening right now. And I would say that even when we're doing it in community, like, grief is individual. Like I said, everyone's like way of coping and understanding and experience grief is going to be different. So also leave room for those differences. Like, we can have a shared experience, like a community being on fire, or like for my family, like losing my mother, but me and my brothers all grieved differently, but we all grieved, right? And so leaving space for like grieving together and also individually. And the final thing I would say, which I think this one is always like, this one feels really important, is that, and it might be hard for people, but don't ask what people need help with, and try not to say like, anything you need, I'll be there. Because honestly, when you are deep in grief, the last thing that you know how to do, or the last thing that you like have capacity for, is to actually like figure out like the
Mm-hmm.
practical needs, you know? So, I mean, some people might be able to, but like for me, I would say like when I was in grief with my mom, for example, like my friends really wanted to see me, and I didn't really know how to be around people. And I was like talking to them. Two of my friends own like a cleaning business. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna like clean my house, like clean my parents' house while my mom is in the hospital. So that when she comes back and they're like, great, we're gonna come over and clean. We have all the supplies, we have everything, we're just gonna come over. Like, okay. And afterwards they were like, well, we knew that you needed help, and also we knew that that was like the way to see you, because we wanted to see you, but we knew you weren't going to hang out, so we just did the thing that you said you were doing, right? Or people just like brought food over. They weren't like, what kind of food do you need, or do you need food? They just like brought it over,
Mm-hmm.
knowing that like if we ate it, great, and if we didn't, whatever, we did.
Mm-hmm.
Like just doing something versus like asking or waiting for that person can be really helpful. Small things, not things that overstep, but
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So listen if the person is saying what they want.
yep.
And then if they're not, but you still want to help, don't ask them because they don't have the capacity to
Yeah.
respond.
Try and come up with something.
Totally.
And honestly, food is always a good one. I think like it's always one that like, in my Derby community, in my friend group, if someone's going through something, we like send them a DoorDash card, because we're like, you know what? Food is one of those things that like we always need to eat, but the capacity to make food and buy groceries and do that stuff, that's like one of the first things that can kind of fall to the side when we're in, any type of hard time. So, I mean, I would say that is always a good call, is like buy them groceries if you know what they like, or get them a DoorDash card, or a card to their favorite restaurant, or make them something they love and bring it over and just say, I don't care if you eat it now or whatever, but here you go. Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, seriously, it's like always a good one.
I love that. It's also, yeah, my brother had a baby a year ago, or almost 2 years ago, and that was even that at a beautiful time. They weren't even grieving, but it was just a big time, and that was the biggest thing that they asked for. It was like, please, just bring us food. So
Totally.
yes, yes, okay. So to wrap up our conversation, before I ask this question, I just want to say kind of the why of why I decided to invite Mady into the community space to offer this workshop. And it's because if you've listened to the last few episodes, this season is an opportunity to learn the lessons and learn the experience of letting go, of releasing, of maybe grieving. And as you have discovered within this conversation, that doesn't only mean losing a loved one in death, and it very much can, but there are many different ways that we grieve. And this season is an opportunity to be able to dive into the messy, but also beautiful at the very same time process of letting go. So I think it'll be a really wonderful opportunity for members to be able to learn from Mady and to be able to grieve together, like we've talked about. So, Mady, could you tell us a little bit more about the workshop that you'll be facilitating called Gently Grieving?
Yeah. I want to say, first of all, too, like, thank you for inviting me into the community space and inviting me on the podcast. I feel very honored and grateful to get to be a part of the Moonflower Path experience. The workshop, Gently Grieving, offer community members an opportunity to, like I said, I think at the beginning, to kind of understand grief from, a more complex place than just death, and to learn a little bit about how to walk with it day to day, and like what it can look like to allow grief into our life, not to avoid it or to try and skirt around it, but to like actually allow it in and to have, for lack of better word, but I think it's actually the perfect word, is like how to have a relationship with your grief and how to make that a healthy relationship that involves listening and communication and time spent. And as part of the workshop, we are going to build an altar, like a grief altar, which is like a ritual practice that I do quite frequently. And so we're going to learn a little bit about how to do that and do that together in the space, just even a mini one during the workshop. And then you'll be able to take that learning and kind of integrate it into maybe like the times in the year where your grief feels really big, or times in the year where you feel like you really want to connect with your grief and like honor it and give it space. And I'm really excited. I'm excited to be able to do that with people and for it to be held by you as well. And I think that it's going to be a really, like, I want to say good, even though we don't always associate that with grief, but I think it's going to be a really good workshop that allows a space to like have the hard things be present, but also learn how to communicate with those hard things and how to understand them. And so hopefully that's what people walk away with, is like, how can I communicate and connect and be in relationship with my grief a little differently, and maybe in a way that feels a little bit more aligned and a little bit more safe. So that's my hope for the workshop.
I think the biggest reason as to why I'm really looking forward to this is because just with you and I having many conversations on a very regular basis, I have firsthand had the pleasure of feeling your energy and being held by you in conversations that we've had. And I know that I also have a unique ability of being able to hold space for folks. And also the community members, like I'm just mentioning this just in case like folks are like, well, this is like really tender stuff for us to be talking about with people that we might not know. And just know that this community and all of the folks that are in this space, like we know how to be with each other amongst hard things and hold space for each other. And this is a space for people who are really tender-hearted, and you're going to be really welcomed in that through the folks in the community space, by Mady, by myself. So I feel like I do really want to say that, because this is not easy stuff, but we know how to be with each other when it comes to not easy stuff. So yeah, because it's important. Well, thank you so freaking much for coming on to, you're the first guest of season 2, so this is very exciting. Yeah,
So exciting.
yeah.
I love to be number one and competitive.
Yes. You win, whatever it is. Oh man. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you. I feel really grateful to have had the opportunity and to share and to talk with you. And I really look forward to the workshop that we're going to do for your community members, and continuing to talk with you as we always do, but also to work together too. Yeah.
All right. Steph's signing off. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of the Moonflower Path podcast. I'm your host, Carolyn, and ways that you can find more support from me and this cozy community are all found in the show notes. Please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing this podcast with a friend. Those are the best ways to show your support for this free and accessible resource. Wishing you a gentle rest of your day, and I look forward to connecting again with you very soon.